Hey everybody, this is Dan, and today I want to talk about advertising and consumerism in the United States. And to say that we live in a consumer culture is an understatement. And we've already talked about the rise of these big corporations. We talked about Standard Oil, and we talked about Carnegie Steel and the Transcontinental Railroad, but we really haven't talked about mass manufacturing of consumer products and the advertising that went along with it. Now, probably the best example of a well-known product manufacturer and advertiser is Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble, or P&G, was founded in 1837 as a manufacturer of soap and candles. And Procter & Gamble met because they married sisters, and they got together in Cincinnati. And it turns out Cincinnati was a great location for their manufacturing because at the time, Cincinnati was the major meatpacking hub in the United States because it was fairly far west and it was on the Ohio River, before Chicago became the meatpacking capital. And it was a good location for Procter & Gamble because animal fat and animal byproducts are necessary raw materials for the manufacture of both soap and candles. So it turns out Cincinnati was an ideal location for the company, and they're still there today. As a growing manufacturer, P&G got their first big break during the Civil War when the U.S. government awarded them a contract to make soap and candles for the Union Army. Now, not only did this keep their factories running at capacity, but it also established brand recognition among the soldiers who were familiar with the products and loyal to the products after their return home after the war. And from there, P&G developed some very famous brands. Ivory Soap in the 1870s, Crisco in 1911, and so on. So they're a good example of a consumer products company in the 1800s. Now, P&G did two things that I think are really important for us to latch onto, especially business students. First, they set up a research lab back in 1890 to learn about soap making and candle manufacturing, and one of the first companies in the country really to set up a research and development program. Now, R&D is certainly a big expense, but it almost always pays off in the long run, and it certainly did for P&G. The other thing P&G did early on is that they advertised and established their brand. Now, Ivory started advertising early on in the 1880s, 1890s, and to this day it's one of the best known brands in the U.S. You have to keep your brand in front of customers, and P&G was very good at doing that. The other thing that's interesting about P&G is, if you remember, I mentioned that when they started they were a candle manufacturer. But something happened in the 1920s, and the market for candles was no longer a very good market. And if you think about it, with the rise of electricity and the light bulb, you can see how there was no longer really a market for candles in this country. But by then, P&G had really diversified their product line with not only soap brands, but getting into more food products and other household products. So the loss of candle manufacturing really didn't hurt them that much. But there's an important lesson there. As a business, you want to be able to obsolete yourself. We talked about Schumpeter, the economist, and this idea of creative destruction. And that is a good example of that is Procter & Gamble and candle manufacturing. Now, while P&G's story illustrates an example of mass manufacturing and really the growth of retail products, there are a number of other brands with a similar trajectory. One of them, a good example, would be American Safety Razor. And American Safety Razor became the Gillette Company in 1901. Interesting side note, the founder of Gillette, a gentleman named King Camp Gillette, was actually a utopian novelist. And he was one of the first business persons to think about this idea of giving away the razor and selling the blades for a guaranteed revenue stream. And obviously that's been a very successful story for Gillette. Now, as a historian, the sources I typically look at consist of documents and text. But when we're looking at a history of business, especially a history of maybe brands and advertising, we can look at logos and print ads as good sources because they tell a story about enduring brands and how long companies have been around and the demographics of the country at the time. So, one of the things I like to do, it's kind of fun, is, you can look at the oldest logos in the country that are still in use, and it really reveals a snapshot of the history of brands in the United States. Now, the oldest logo in continual use in the U.S., according to many people, is John Deere. And we already talked about John Deere. If you remember, he invented the steel plow back in 1837, and that logo and brand of John Deere has endured for well over 100 years now. And actually, if you look at the original logo and the logo today, they're very similar. Some other brands and logos that have gone unchanged over the years are Coca-Cola and Johnson & Johnson. Those are both from 1886. Campbell Soup, 1869, General Electric, 1892, Goodyear Rubber, 1898, and Sherwin-Williams in 1905. And it's interesting to go back and look at their marketing and look at their logos because things haven't changed much over the past 100 years, and all of those brands are still very strong in the marketplace. Now, one of the things that these companies all had in common was either strong research and development or strong marketing and advertising, or both. So I think there's really a lesson there as far as business is concerned, that you need to continually innovate and you need to continually market, and the history of these brands certainly reveals corporations that did both of those things. The other interesting thing about these brands is that they reflect the demographic changes that are occurring in the country at the turn of the century. Packaged food products from Campbell Soup, Johnson & Johnson, and P&G, health and beauty care, these categories reflect the rise of a middle class and urbanization, the urban society that's starting to become established in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So you start to get a feel for how consumerism begins to take off in this period of time, and also how the demographics begin to change in the country. There are a number of consumer categories we can look at, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and look at some print advertisements from the same turn of the century period, and we'll look at advertisements in about 10 different consumer categories: household appliances, health and beauty, packaged food, electronics, automobiles, travel, medicine, beer, do-it-yourself products. These are all product categories that reflect a new consumer class that's rising at the turn of the century. And many of the products that we'll see in these print ads are the same as what we're familiar with today, but you'll see that in many cases the ads are totally different, or at least the ingredients are totally different than we're familiar with today. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these ads. All right, let's take a look at some advertisements from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Here's a Quaker Oats ad, and this is interesting because there's a picture of the Capitol building in the ad, sort of playing to this idea of nationalism, purity, American values. Here's an ad for Campbell's Soup, and I believe this one's from about 1915, and it's appealing to the family values of a healthy soup for healthy kids. And the Campbell's kids were created by a woman named Grace Drayton, by the way. Coca-Cola, this is a very early ad, back when Coke actually had coca in it, which is the raw material for cocaine and codeine. So it was advertised more as a medicine for headaches, melancholy. Here is a Budweiser ad, and you can see that this hasn't changed much at all over the years. It's almost identical to today's logo. And this was from 1904, well before Prohibition, of course. Here's an ad for Lucky Strike cigarettes. This is appealing to women and this idea that smoking keeps you thin, but it's also interesting because it talks about throat protection and how cigarettes protect against irritation and cough. So it's a little bit different than the way we look at cigarettes today. Health and beauty was certainly a big category, again, reinforcing gender roles. Here's an ad for Maybelline eye makeup back in the early 1900s. And then there's also an ad here for Pond's cold cream, again with a woman, and this idea that health and beauty is a big category. And this is from 1911, I believe. For the next ad, here's pharmaceuticals. Here's Bayer aspirin. This is a little different. They're advertising both aspirin and heroin in the same ad, so you can see the regulation for drugs that could be sold over the counter is a little different. The Edison phonograph is interesting because it was really sort of the iPod of the day, and that consumer category of electronics has been popular ever since. And it all started with Edison and the phonograph. The KitchenAid mixer, again, this is reinforcing women's roles in the kitchen, and with electrification, all of these kitchen appliances were being advertised as a faster and a more efficient way for food. This is a great ad from Dutch Boy Paints, and you can see up in the corner it's advertising the benefits of lead, all lead paint, and it's got a child on the ad featured. So a little bit different than the way we look at paints today. This is an ad from Burlington and Missouri Railroad talking about or encouraging people to move out west and showing how they can get land for very cheap out in Iowa and Nebraska, just past the homestead days. Here's the famous Model T. Now, we haven't talked about the automobile industry yet, and we will in a future lecture, but this is an ad from Ford for the Model T, $850, which actually it came down in price later. And here is a Model D Toledo car made by American Bicycle Company, and that's sold for $1,100, and that's from the early 1900s as well. So that's a quick look at some of the advertisements and you know, talking about the various categories, and you can see how gender roles were reinforced, and you can see how the ads were different than what we see today. So that was a quick look at brands and advertisements from this time period in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and I wanted you to get a feel for how these ads and how these product categories reflect the changing demographics going on in the country at the time, and also, you know, just keep in mind this idea that these long-standing brands, you know, had a few things in common. They were all expert marketers. They were all experts in research and development and product line diversification. So when we look at a history of business, we can look at who the survivors are and gain some insight to as what, you know, their best practices were. So that's it for now. Everybody have a great week, and I'll see you again next week. Take care.